Another approach to managing your pasture is something called patch burn grazing. It's a technique that's been developed out in the Great Plains and received a lot of attention recently. The way this works is that you take a pasture and divide it up into patches. In our example here, we divided it into 3 patches. One of those patches is burned each spring, year 2, year 3. And the reason this works is that what the cattle do is they go to the most recently burned patch, so in this case right there, and they focus most of their grazing effort there because that is the most palatable, high-quality forage. So during this time, the other 2 patches are allowed to rest. The longer since it's been burned, the least the cattle use it, and the greater the rest. In practice, the way we implement patch burn grazing is with a spring fire. Early April is the best time in Tennessee, but what we're really looking for is the point at which those plants are breaking dormancy. So that may be a little bit earlier, a little bit later, depending on where you are. Another thing I want to point out with this fire is that because this is a grazed pasture, the amount of fuel out there is reduced, and so the fire can be set and managed fairly easily. Unlike, for instance, and some of y'all may be familiar with this, burning an idle native grass field, which has a huge amount of fuel and very intense flames. After the burn, these grasses green up rapidly, producing a large amount of very palatable and very nutritious forage. Because it's so nutritious and palatable, cattle selectively graze this rather than nearby patches that are unburned. Here's an example of a pasture that we have used patch burn grazing on, and what you can see is the burned half of that pasture has been grazed much more closely, in other words, heavier grazing pressure than the unburned half of that pasture. The second pasture likewise was treated with patch burn grazing. Now in this case we don't see quite as big a difference in height, so the grazing pressure has not been quite so lopsided in favor of the burned area, but we still notice that the burned area is shorter. It's a darker green, and that's because of the extra nitrogen that resulted from the burn being picked up by those plants. And also you can make out that on this burn side, a lot of last year's senescent dead material is gone because it's been burned up. I want to point out that this difference in selectivity you see in these 2 pastures is really the result of 2 things. One, how quickly we stock the pasture after the burn, and number 2, how heavily we stock the pasture. So in this case, where there's a lot of selectivity, we stock lightly and we stocked quickly. Over here, we allowed more time to pass between the burn and the stocking. So this is about 2 weeks, this is about 4 weeks. And the stocking was somewhat heavier. So that's what helps regulate how heavily the cattle focus on that recently burned area. Despite the heavy grazing pressure that this year's burn, the current year's burn, receives from cattle because of that forage quality, under a patch burn graze system, the subsequent burns shift cattle grazing pressure away from this piece to one of the other patches. And as a result, even though this is a whole lot shorter than it should be for continuous season-long grazing, which is what happens in patch burn grazing, it still gets enough rest in the next 2 years that the pasture quality is not degraded.